colleagues and friends joining us virtually, and to those here in Los Angeles. Thank you for joining us for the 2022 HACR Executive Programs Afternoon Business Sessions. Now, welcome back to the stage, the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility's Senior Vice President of Operations, Sylvia Perez Cash.
Hi again, welcome back. Thank you for rejoining us after lunch, and thank you to our virtual attendees. We appreciate you hanging in there with us, and we hope you're enjoying the content today. What a wonderful discussion that we've been having all day, frankly, including these last lunch sessions. We've heard about global lens, wide lens, and leadership and inclusivity. We've heard about using data, frankly, to be our own advocates, right? And that we are actually agents of change in our own right today in the positions you hold. We've learned about creating those opportunities for ourselves as advocates. We speak a lot about allies, and I don't want to undermine that. Allies are important, but there's a lot that we can do, including identifying and creating those opportunities, those business opportunities, those political opportunities, and those relationships that we need to move forward together. So I just think that's really motivating and wonderful. We're going to continue this conversation with a look into the boardroom, another one of those entre familia inside views on one of the most prestigious spaces in corporate America. What happens around that board table? What happens in conversation with those CEOs and those independent directors? We're going to hear a little bit about that. It's no secret that Latinos are underrepresented in corporate boardrooms. HACR recognizes this fact and helped quantify the problem with leading research produced in collaboration with Deloitte and the Alliance for Board Diversity. What we found was that approximately 4.1% of all Fortune 500 board seats were held by people who identified as Latinx. That's according to the most recent Deloitte and ABD Missing Pieces report, the Board Diversity Census of Women and Minorities on Fortune 500 boards, the 6th edition. If you're wondering where do I find that, you can go to the Alliance for Board Diversity's website or to HACR's website. Either one will work out just fine. I encourage you to read it. This session is designed around that experience and that context and that knowledge. It offers, as I said, a glimpse into the boardroom through the lens of a specific company. We are honored today that joining us to offer that lens and to share that story is Edison International, both their CEO and one of their corporate board directors. Here to moderate that session is the Assistant Managing Director of the Wall Street Journal. We are deeply grateful that this is now his 4th time moderating this important conversation with HACR. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Steve Wisniewski, of the Wall Street Journal.
Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to see you here. I'm happy to be back in person as well. Very exciting. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. We're going to have a great discussion about how Edison's board works and get some deeper insights on the landscape for what it takes to be a board member and the kinds of issues that boards deal with. And with a specific lens looking at how Latinos and others who aspire to get to the board can prepare themselves to get there. So joining me today will be Pedro Pizarro, who is the president and CEO of Edison International. He's been at Edison International since 1999. He's been in his current role for just about 6 years. And also Michael Camuñez, who is the president and CEO of Monarch Global Strategies, which provides advice to companies looking to do business in emerging markets. He is an independent director at Edison International. Gentlemen, please join me in welcoming them. Good afternoon.
Hey, Steve.
Lovely to see you. So let's get started, and Pedro, I'll start with you. I'd like if you could tell the room a little bit about what the board is like at Edison International in terms of how often you meet, how the agenda is set for meetings. If you could just walk us through that and give us an introduction into the board activity at Edison International.
Sure. Well, just start by saying thanks for having me here, and thanks, Sid. Really appreciate it. Love what HACR does. So our board, we have 10 independent directors and myself. We meet something like 6 times a year. Now, Michael will probably quickly say it's just 6 because, as things pop up, we might have telephone calls or the like. We usually meet for a day of committee meetings, have a dinner together, and then have a second day with a full board meeting. And the range of topics is what you might imagine. It starts with safety and our values, but all the key things that are critical to the business.
And what has dominated the agenda recently? You just touched on a few issues, but have there been any particular hot topics? Obviously, you're at the forefront of dealing with ways to counter climate change or the effects of climate change and decarbonization, et cetera. What have you been focused on lately?
So to be very candid, the top 3 over the last several years have been wildfires, wildfires, and wildfires. You mentioned climate change. The reality is that California is at the leading edge of experiencing the impacts of climate change. But folks, we ain't alone, right? And we're going to be seeing more and more of those impacts nationally and globally. Starting with the first massive events in 2017, it was larger than anybody had ever imagined for the state, but it really showed the convergence of climate change with development in high fire risk areas. So navigating through the safety implications of that, the operational implications, the regulatory and legislative needs, working with the state to secure a new framework for how utilities can navigate through wildfire liabilities, dealing with the liabilities from prior fires. But again, above all, looking at how we harden our system and getting good guidance and support from the board in terms of, in fact, Michael, I think it was you who in one of our meetings said something like, this is about public safety, right? We'll talk about cost later, but we're going to do whatever we need to do to keep our public safe. And so today, we believe we have reduced the risk from our infrastructure by 65 to 70% in just 4 short years. So that's really been a main topic. In addition to that, though, I appreciate that with support from the board, while that has been the big topic for us, Stephen, it has not been the only topic. And I was at the company for the California energy crisis, and I got to tell you, 20 years ago, everything stopped. And we've managed to not have everything stop. So even as we dealt with that issue, we've continued our push on the clean energy transition. We've continued our thought leadership in developing analysis and putting on white papers and engaging with policymakers in Washington and Sacramento globally on how our industry contributes to the economy as a whole, decarbonizing. So that's been a big focus area, along with programs that have stemmed from that. And then, safety is another big topic for the board consistently. And I'll close with a number of other things I can mention, but I want to point out, particularly with this audience, that at least a couple of times a year, one of our big topics is diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we take it seriously, starting with the board where 8 out of 11 of us are diverse in one way or another, pushing through to our employee base, and frankly, wanting to reflect our communities and serve them well.
We'll definitely dive into that a little more in a moment. Michael, how long have you been on the board, and what roles do you perform on the board?
Great. Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you. I see some old friends in the audience. It's always good to be with you, Sid. And Steve, thanks for doing this, Stephen. This is my 5th year on the board, which is kind of hard to believe.
Feels like how many, though?
Feels like I just got there. But it's been 5 very dynamic, exciting years. I serve on 2 committees principally, the Audit and Finance Committee and on the Nominating and Governance Committee. So my responsibilities on the Audit and Finance side are primarily related to enterprise risk management. And as you can appreciate with a public utility, we have a lot of enterprise risks that go beyond just the traditional types of corporate risks that many companies, all companies face. But we run power lines through communities, and it's a very important safety component. We have a separate safety committee that looks into that as well. And then and we also deal with our capital budget and some broader financial issues. And then on the Nom/Gov side, our primary responsibility is to, first and foremost, help the board with the selection of new directors, and then manage our corporate governance programs, which cover a wide range of issues, from how we structure ourselves in the form of committees, but also how we look at some new emerging issues that I'm sure we'll get into around DEI, around ESG, and other things as they relate to how the company manages that.
So you have a long experience working in international trade, international economics, advising businesses. You have a law degree, law background. How did all of those skills prepare you to do the job you're doing now as an independent director?
Well, actually, I like to think, you can't, when I'm talking to young people or mid-career folks who are interested in doing similar kinds of things and they're looking for the recipe or the formula, and at the end of the day, there is no formula. Every career path is different, and there's a lot of luck involved also. But I do like to believe, and I do think that my background is kind of been at the intersection of public policy, law, and business. And those three vectors, if you will, turn out to be really helpful. My legal background, I spent a number of years as a partner at O'Melveny & Myers, a big firm here in California, nationally, internationally, advising corporate audit committees and corporate boards and CEOs around a whole range of issues and in the domestic and international context. And that was hugely valuable preparation. One of my last assignments before I left for the White House was working on the housing crisis and the great financial, the meltdown. We were the mortgage-backed securities lenders that were, wreaking havoc on the economy. That was hugely valuable experience. My service in government, I think, has been really helpful. Edison, at the end of the day, is a regulated industry. Our work with mainly the state government, but Pedro's in Washington all the time at the White House, talking to the Secretary of Energy, the FERC, and just the administration generally as it tries to grapple with how we move to a clean future or to a green future and update the grid and other areas that Pedro's been a thought leader on. So being in government has been helpful not just here but to my board service generally. You understand how the government works and how politics can influence public policy and how public policy obviously affects our business and the bottom line. And then, of course, the business aspect of it is just I run my own company and I have advised for years now public company CEOs and boards on their businesses, especially in the international context as they think about moving to emerging markets and doing business abroad. So it's been a nice balance, a good combination. I mean, Pedro will be able to comment whether it's actually added any value or not, but I like to think that one of the nice things, and I'll close with this, is when we look at a board from a nominating governance committee perspective, we do a skills matrix, and we report this publicly, but we're always looking for people who have, who bring distinctive perspectives and backgrounds. Pedro mentioned DEI, that's an important part of it. Lived experience is important, but your professional background is also important. We have CFOs, we have folks that have been running operating companies, people that have been managing other utility companies, but all of us, I would say, bring something slightly unique and distinctive to the board, and collectively that board mix, I think, provides for ultimately the kind of resource that management needs to thought partner with in the pursuit of the corporate strategy.
That's a perfect segue to the question, Pedro, of how it is that you and your executive team work with the board. How much do you lean on individual members and committees to help you do your job effectively?
It's a strong partnership. And again, the board's role is support and oversight. So it is a balance there. I really appreciate Michael and the other 9 independent directors. Part of the team, there comes a moment where they're also providing oversight and judging how we did and setting compensation and all those important things. But as we navigate through some of these tough challenges, it's frankly great to have folks who have commitment to the company and our customers and great expertise. So how exactly do we do that? My immediate team, to the Edison Managing Committee, so there's 8 of us total, and that has all the principal business leaders and functional leaders. The board knows each and every one of those really well. They're in the boardroom all the time. Depending on the topic, they'll be working closely with some of the committees. So for example, our CFO, Maria Rigatti, is very close to the Audit and Finance Committee, right? Because it's where that action takes place. But she's in the boardroom, for just about everything as well. And so there's that working partnership at a topic level. There's, good clarity, I think, in terms of what topics merit board review. Sometimes it's for information, sometimes it's for approval. Sometimes it's for just thought partnership. There's that formal process that happens to the committee meetings and the board meetings. There's informal interactions. There's field tours that we do with the board so that they get to, kick the tires a little bit on the culture and, get to meet some, real life team members who are not part of the executive team, somebody in a field station or what have you. So it's really, that relationship with the board takes on a number of dimensions. There's also engagement with our business resource groups, which are such an important part of the company. And I was talking with Sid earlier about our Latinos for Engagement, Advancement, and Development lead. So it's been a few years now. We need to do it again, Michael. But Michael and I did a joint session with LEAD and also with Lighthouse, which is our LGBTQ plus advocacy group. And so we had a panel discussion with them. That was a different way in which a few hundred employees got to meet Michael, in a different context, and we got to chat there. So it gives you a sense that there's no one way that this happens, but the core work ends up happening through, management, developing, not only information, but also recommendations, charting a course, setting strategy, and, engaging with the board through committees and through the broad board itself.
What's important to you in terms of board composition? And how has the board composition at Edison, and either of you can address this, changed over the past decade or so?
So actually, I'll start by saying that the board relationship and the nature of boards in corporate America has changed over my career. And they are much more independent. I think the days of the cozy board that, basically handpicked by a CEO, I'm being really candid here, right? Handpicked by a CEO and kind of the cronies and, what the CEO says is what everybody, that there might be a few of those left out there. I hope, I don't think they'll last long, right? And so I really value and respect the independence of the board. At the same time, it's a relationship, and they're not running the company day to day, right? My team and I are doing that. And so it's just a different lived experience in terms of the roles that we have. And so as I think about the board, I think Michael covered it well, right? That skills matrix that the Nominating and Governance Committee uses to keep a check on, hey, do we have all the different cylinders that we need? Actually, I should say it differently. Do we have all the different batteries that we need? Because, we're moving to electric vehicles, so the cylinders is a thing of the past. But do we have all the components that we need on that board? Disciplines like Michael was mentioning, that's a key part of it. The other thing that I look for and that I feel very blessed that we have with our board, while everybody has their spike, you need a base level of competence and deep competence, right? That folks are going to be comfortable with all the different subject areas. So it's a T model, right, where everybody has a base level and then they have their spike or 2 or 3, and they contribute those in the board setting. So having that diversity of thought ultimately is critical. And by the way, having that diversity of background contributes to having good diversity of thought.
Michael?
I would just say on the board management relationship generally, and I think this is really important for those aspiring to get on a board to really have clarity around what directors do and don't do. I mean, at the end of the day, our responsibility, I think, comes down to 3 things. We hire and fire, if necessary, the CEO, right? We pick the horse, we pick the leader, and we get behind him or her and support him or her as much as possible. But ultimately, as Pedro says, in public companies and in most companies, the CEO, unless you have an executive chairman who's in a dual-hatted role, who's the CEO and chairman, but generally, the CEO and the management team run the company. So we pick that leader who then picks his or her management team with the board's input. And we do a lot of talk around succession planning and of our key leadership positions, and the board has a lot of visibility on up-and-coming leaders in the business, and we give Pedro feedback. And although he's responsible for hiring, it's an informed view from the board. Second, strategy. Once a year at least, we have a strategy session where we talk about long-term strategy and intermediate and short-term strategy. So the board is responsible for setting the overall strategic direction of the company with obviously management's guidance. And I think that's where the board is able to really weigh in if we think there's a need for a course correction. If you have a good executive like Pedro, who's one of the best in the business, often what you have is just a good discussion around the very good ideas that the management team has brought forward. But I think the board is still able to kind of weigh in on the margins and if there were a need for a major course correction in different circumstances, that would be the board's opportunity. And then we approve the budget, basically. And it works very seamlessly and very collaboratively. And as a board, as an independent director, you always have to be careful not to develop Stockholm syndrome or to get too cozy with your management team, because at the end of the day, you have legal duties to your shareholders, right, and to your stakeholders. And you have to fulfill those fiduciary responsibilities. But the best companies, in my opinion, work the best when there is that very collaborative, synergistic, not antagonistic relationship, because problems will surface, challenges will surface, and you have to have a lot of trust in the boardroom between management and the board. You want management to be able to come forward. There are many times Pedro will come forward and share bad news with us, right? Or something that maybe he isn't obligated to do, but he does. He's very transparent, and that builds a lot of trust. So I think that chemistry is important. I think in my own short tenure, I've seen, across other companies that I serve in as well, boards are changing quickly. There's a lot of institutional shareholder pressure, as you know, on diversifying the board, and that's a good thing. And I'm very pleased that our board is 50% men and women. We have gender parity and a lot of other kinds of diversity as well.
We're going to add something?
No. I think Michael covered it well.
I wanted to turn to something that I learned just before we came on stage here, which is that though you've had this long experience doing so many things, and at the moment you serve on a number of boards, your first corporate board was actually Edison. What led to that? And was it something that you thought, oh, I want to be a corporate board director at some point?
Yeah, when I left government, so my last stint in the Obama administration, I came out having served at the White House and then as Assistant Secretary of Commerce. And when I came back to the private sector, I deliberately chose not to return to a law firm as a lawyer per se, but I did join a firm, but it was to be CEO of a separate business unit that was not practicing law. And the reason for that was because I had, as you grow professionally, you think about what career path you want to take, and being a corporate public company director was something that I identified was something I wanted to do. But I knew it would take time, and it was a little bit like catching lightning in a bottle. As it turns out, with Edison specifically, first let me just say that Edison's a company that, growing up professionally in LA, was a company I always admired as a young professional. It was a company, back in the day, and I hope still today, but that was sort of a captain of civil society. The CEO and directors of Edison were well-known civic leaders. Edison was a company deeply invested in the community. I just always had a high degree of admiration. One of my mentors at O'Melveny, Warren Christopher, had a deep relationship with the company, I think as a director as well, and just a company that I really looked up to. It turns out that for the seat I'm sitting in, Edison worked with a headhunter, Korn Ferry. And the partner in charge of that search happened to know another corporate director who knew me well. And they were looking at the time, I think, for somebody with my profile, more or less, maybe a lawyer with new California and federal politics, kind of a public policy background. And so I got a call and said, would you be interested? And when I heard it was Edison, I had a hard time keeping it together. I was so excited. And then I had a chance to come in and meet Pedro and interview with the board, and really, they took a chance on me. Pedro deserves credit for taking a chance on a new director, because a lot of companies will not, they want somebody with corporate experience. It's like getting credit. How do you build credit if you don't have credit? How do you get on a board if you never sit around? Now, in my case, I had been on several large boards and had chaired nonprofit boards, and so I had board experience. It just wasn't corporate board experience. So
Is it substantially different?
Oh yeah, very much so. It's much more rigorous, and of course, legally speaking, the fiduciary duties are the same to an extent, but it's a very different experience. But it's good. What's important is if you're on a nonprofit board or a large charitable board or something, you learn about board culture. You learn how to be collegial. You learn how to build consensus, and the vast majority of what boards do is by consensus. And so those are important skills to have. The other thing you learn is the role of a director versus a manager, right? In the nonprofit world, sometimes the board gets a little, it's nose in and hands in. In the corporate world, it's very much, nose in and hands out, right? You take a close look, but you understand what's your role and what management's role is.
Yeah, I'd just like to piggyback on one thing that Michael said, and by the way, we are really happy you're in our board.
Thank you.
Worked out very well. That collegiality piece is so important, and the culture of our board is one where people show up having done their homework, and apologies, but we send them a lot of stuff, and we try to skinny that down, but the reality is we have a lot of important stuff going on right now. And so by the time you get through all the various committee decks and the board decks, you're looking at several hundred pages worth of reading for each board cycle. They show up having read that, and by design, because we want to have a conversation when we get in the room. So we're not sitting there with management, generally, walking through a PowerPoint and boring the pants off you, right? It might be a little bit of a recap of the PowerPoint, and then you immediately get into the discussion. We've been through some really tough challenges as a company. And I thought we've been through a lot when I was a young executive, when we went through the California energy crisis. I won't lie, this wildfire period has been existential. I'm proud of how the company has come through that. And I'm really proud of the board, frankly, hanging in there, because there were a number of tough decisions that we had to make as directors. That, those are the things that can fracture a board. And one of the things we've done is have a culture where, frankly, we insist on having the debates inside the boardroom. And we may end up in consensus, but there have been some topics where there's a whole lot of debate before you get to consensus, and it's sometimes hard to see how you are going to get to consensus. But that's been critical, because that way you're, as an organization, you're sorting through this tough stuff, and you're understanding where people have concerns, and you're really seeing the pros and cons of things. And sometimes it's management debating with some board members. Sometimes it's board members debating with each other. But it's constructive, it's collegial, it's built on a base of mutual respect and shared sense of mission. And we're very fortunate we have that. And frankly, our board, I think, today is stronger than it's ever been. And I was going to say in spite of, but maybe it's because we've had to go through such challenges.
So you've gone through these challenges. You have to address the issues, whether they're the wildfires or the big strategic thrust to decarbonize the economy. Where does DEI fit in? You alluded to it earlier. It's obviously important and taken on greater prominence probably over the past decade or so. But how does it fit on your agenda?
It's a big part of it, and it has multiple elements to it. And it starts obviously with making sure that our company looks like our community. Now that sounds simple. It's actually more complex than it sounds. Let's focus on the Latino community, because we're here at HACR, right? So 30-some% of our community, 32% of our community has Latino or Hispanic background. And if you look at our workforce, we stack up really well against, I think we're a little bit more than that across our workforce. Let's go over to the executive side. So around 11.6% of our executives are Latino or Hispanic. However, the market from which we recruit executives is not just a local market, it's the national market. And so if you look at availability at a national level, 8.8% of executives are Latino or Hispanic across the US. So I feel pretty good that, we're doing better than the pool from which we recruit. At the same time, though, and this gets to answering your question squarely, as a corporation, I think we have a responsibility to help continue to raise the bar so that someday the national pool for executives looks just like the local pool. And so I'd like to think that we can continue to try to do better than just the 8.8% and to try and help our group get closer to where the community is. So employee representation is one part of it. It goes beyond representation, though, and the board has been a great partner and also a great stimulant in terms of making sure that we're not just looking at that simple piece. So today, I will put our disclosures against any company in the S&P 500 because we're providing deep transparency, not only around that representation topic, but we go beyond that. We're looking at pay equity, right? And so we post pay by gender and by ethnic and racial groups for the company. And by the way, the punchline is, if you look on a role-to-role basis, people who have the same job make the same amount of money for that job. If you look at an average of all women versus all men, you will see a difference because even though my team is half and half, I'm CEO, I'm male, right? And we do have still more men than women in the more senior roles. So that influences the overall average, which means we need to continue working on representation. We publish employee sentiment, pulse surveys, good, bad, and the ugly. We detected a signal in our pulse surveys back in 2019 around our Black and African American community, and saw that our Black employees were not feeling as much trust and engagement as the rest of our population. So that raised the question of what's that? And so we sought some outside help. We did focus groups. We got some learnings from it that led to a number of new commitments. And we put all of that in our DEI report externally. It's almost like a 12-step program, right? Step one is recognize the problem. So in general, we do really well, but where we had a blip, we wanted to be transparent about it because that then redoubles the commitment that we have as a company. It's also about DEI. It's also about what we do with our supplier base. And so, purchasing from small and diverse business enterprises is something really important that we do. And it helps build the community around us. And then there's our charitable giving, where I think something like 80% of the $20+ million we give every year is directed towards diverse and underserved communities. So from a board perspective, it's all of those. It fits under the broader umbrella of ESG that Michael mentioned earlier, the S. But it's also important in building support with our public and being viewed as an attractive employer so we can help recruit and retain the best talent.
Let me just offer a perspective from the board. I mean, it starts with our CEO, right? It's no coincidence that we have one of the few, and we're very proud of, we think one of the few and one of the very best Latino CEOs in America, in a Fortune 250 company. It's pretty extraordinary and historic in that sense. And it starts with the board selected Pedro. And they didn't select him because he's Latino. They selected him because he's an incredible executive with an extraordinary background and an impeccable academic and professional pedigree.
I'm not sure who he's talking about, but that's okay.
But he also happens to be Latino. I still count Puerto Ricans as Latino, so I guess we'll...
Hey, mira, no empieces.
But, and then, so we're fortunate, but we don't stop there. And as Pedro will tell you, we look deeply at succession planning. I remember once when I was hiring partner at Old Melvin and Myers, we had this discussion, and we were talking about in the military, there's this concept of deep selection, where generals are often identified early in their careers, often at West Point or the Naval Academy, in the case of admirals. And I think that's true of talent generally. And so we're constantly pushing to have programs where we identify talent and create opportunities for talent to rise. And I think we have a management team that's deeply committed to that. But it's hard work, let's be honest. Every company in America struggles with this, and we're not an exception to that. And then I think we also recognize that we have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And so we hold ourselves to a high standard. We have sent headhunters back for refresh when they bring candidates that don't meet our criteria. We're not looking for quotas. We're not trying to have one of this and one of that. But we think if you don't have a diverse pool to start with, the odds of you getting to a diverse outcome are very, very low. So we insist in our searches that our headhunters bring forward robust slates. I'm not going to say binders of women, but robust slates of female and diverse candidates so that we have really good candidates to choose from. And I think the results at the end of the day speak for themselves. So it's a work in progress, but I think it takes real firm commitment from the board, the CEO, and throughout the organization. And over time, I'm confident we'll continue to improve.
Are you doing anything specifically to target Latino executives to reduce that delta from the 8% that are available nationwide and the 33% of the market that you serve that's Latino?
Yeah, so look, every time we are doing a search for an executive, we're looking hard, right? And again, over time, I'd like to see us continue to improve that. We have a number of places where, and it's not just about Latino executives, it's Black, it's Asian, it's it's women, it's LGBTQ. Again, we want to see diversity in every sense. But a couple of things that are really critical. I mentioned the business resource groups earlier. Those are fantastic, right? Because they provide a great environment where folks can start developing leadership characteristics. You know, Michael, like you were saying, kind of hard to get credit unless you have it. Well, you know, that's another place for leadership where you might be an individual contributor, but you can start getting leadership experience by becoming the treasurer of LEAD or of the, you know, any one of the other groups. So that's one important place. There are specific programs we do around coaching and talent development. We started a new program coming out of the commitments I mentioned after we saw the concerns with our Black and African American employees. We developed a coaching and talent development accelerator where we're identifying early talent, like Michael was saying. The first cohort of that was all Black and African American employees. The second cohort has now been broadened. This is a cohort every year. Second cohort has now been broadened to include a broader set of folks, including a number of Latino up-and-coming employees. And so that's another way in which we do this. We also partner with a number of Hispanic organizations. We are out on campuses. We're, the association, the Society of Hispanic Engineers has been a really good partner with our recruiting team. So it just gives you a few examples of how we do that.
Mm-hmm. You've touched on a few instances, on a few occasions in our discussion here on how board activity, just generally speaking, has evolved. How has the role of a board member or the way a board operates changed over the past several years? And one thing I'm also curious about is whether the pandemic and the fact that you all had to not be together and find other ways to work, whether that's had any sort of lasting impact on the way you think about the frequency and the format of your communications.
Well, let me offer a perspective from before I was a director, when I was a lawyer advising boards, and there were some important legal changes that happened that fundamentally and profoundly changed the role and responsibilities and liabilities of directors and management for that matter. I'm sure many of you have heard of Sarbanes-Oxley, but you know, Sarbanes-Oxley profoundly increased accountability for everybody in the corporation. And I think since SOX, we've seen sort of an uptick in this phenomenon that Pedro was describing. It's true that in many, still in some, but in the past, many boards, you had a very cozy, hand-picked board that was sort of allies of the CEO, and I think that's largely gone. I think the expectations, I mean, shareholder litigation, the plaintiff's bar ensures that, you know, if you're a director, you know that, you know, the business judgment rule is broad, but you're still fundamentally, you could be found liable if you don't exercise your business judgment with appropriate diligence. And so I have found, you know, in these last 5 years and in the preceding decade, advising boards that a palpable shift in terms of just board engagement, preparation, and a sense of real understanding of their fiduciary duties. I think management is very forthcoming and shares important information. Sometimes it can be overwhelming, but there were times in the wildfire season a few years ago, we were on Zoom, you know, on calls just regularly. It felt like we were meeting, I don't know how often, we met a lot. So I think there's just an uptick in overall engagement that you feel. And the culture at our board and in every board I'm affiliated with is you come prepared, you do your homework. We're not going to go back over and cover stuff that was in the materials. There have been a few times I'm embarrassed to say, well, I'll ask a question and I'll say, what about this? Well, Michael, if you go to page 7 on the slide, it's right there. Like, oops, missed that. There's so much information sometimes you even when you've read the material, you can't retain it all. But there's an expectation that you come prepared and that you really get to work. The Zoom thing, you know, during the pandemic, we just resumed our in-person meetings this year. And we met for almost 2 full years by Zoom. And Zoom has a lot of critics. I actually found it to be very effective. I mean, there's nothing that can replace just being together and the hallway chat and getting coffee and the informal dialogue that builds trust and relationships. But substantively, I don't believe the board suffered by having meetings on Zoom. We were able to be, you know, very efficient. We got very comfortable very quickly. The company was terrific about it, making sure we had all the technology we needed at home, and it's been very effective. And I suspect, although I'm not sure and it's not been decided, but I suspect that we will probably see a future in which some number of board meetings on a regular basis will be remote, because it's just, we've all learned that, my travel in my day job, I used to travel all the time. I travel much less now, even now that travel's back, because I can be just as effective on a Zoom or a web call as I can in person oftentimes.
I think Michael covered it all well. A couple of things I might put an accent on. One, that sense of personal accountability did go up considerably with Sarbanes-Oxley, and it's continued to go up. And the focus from the governance groups, I think, is also much more intense. So, and it's not just the ESG folks at the index funds. I think more and more you're seeing some of the or active portfolio managers asking this kind of questions. So when I became CEO in 2016, we weren't getting these kind of questions other than when we went to Europe, and there we got it from the ESG managers. And then pretty quickly that, just over the 5.5 years I've been CEO, that expanded to the portfolio managers there. It became much more acute with US-based ESG managers, and now we're even getting a few US-based portfolio managers. So that is a trend that is not abating. And by the way, there's an element of it that's good. The business world is moving so much more quickly too that I think adds to the load that the board has and the management has too. So raises the bar in terms of just a landscape of issues and the amount of preparation and all of that. And then on the Zoom point, or Teams for us, because we're using Microsoft Teams. Right. It's a funny point on that, but anyway, yeah. It worked very well, and I agree with Michael. I think we'll end up in a future where there's some cadence of board meetings where we don't have to have people schlep themselves on an airplane. It's more sustainable, no need to use up those emissions, et cetera. But at the same time, there's some core group of number of meetings we need to have in person, and it's the same thing with our employees. We have 13,000 employees. A third of them could not work from home because you can't do the poles and wires remotely, right? But 2/3 did. And for those, we've said that when we get to whatever the final new normal is, for most of them, it'll be in the office 1 to 3 days a week. And we need some amount of that, but not 5 days a week. That said, the reason that the Zoom world worked so well, I believe, was that we consumed social capital that had been built up over the last decade or two. Yeah. And that social capital is the networking, the getting to know folks, having the open time to talk about things. In the virtual world, we had to be much more purposeful about that. So prior to this, I would always meet with directors individually 3 or 4 times a year. I usually try to do it in person. I kept doing that. This time it was virtual. With my own team, I used to have monthly one-on-ones in addition to all the other meetings we're in. In the virtual world, I shifted that to shorter meetings every week because we no longer had the kitchen chat and the talk in the hallway after the meeting. And it's easy to get disconnected. And when you're so focused on just the task at hand, you forget that high-performing teams, research shows high-performing teams actually only spend 40% or so of their time on the widget, and they spend 60% of their time on the team maintenance, the network, the relationship, the language, the culture. And so that's something that for human beings, it still kind of helps to do that in person.
So we're going to turn to questions in a moment, but just one final question for each of you. If you could just give 1 or 2 key points, suggestions that you would give to people who aspire to be on a board. How do they become board ready?
So I think there's a few things. If you're Latino, and I assume most of you are at the HACR conference, I'd encourage you to join an organization like Latino Corporate Directors Association, LCDA, or other corporate readiness programs. There are organizations out there that specialize in really helping you learn about and understand the process of becoming a corporate director and then the actual work of a director. There are director certification programs out there through similar Association of Corporate Directors and whatnot. Some of the major universities and business schools like Stanford offer directors colleges and related things. So why is that important? For one thing, I think it signals to prospective boards that this is something you're really taking seriously and you're genuinely interested in. And I think it's a great way to network as well. Second, networking and not being shy about saying what you want. I mean, before I joined the Edison board, the reason that this person knew to call me is because I had expressly reached out to her. She's a good friend of mine already. She's on 2 big public company boards, and I said, hey, if you ever hear of anything, I'd appreciate it if you keep me in mind. So networking is really important, and in letting people know that you're interested and that you're taking steps to prepare yourself. So much of this is just, like I say, catching lightning in a bottle, because despite, I mean, you're in the best time possible because companies are actively seeking to diversify their board. So if you're Latino and especially Latina, I think there's a really great opportunity at the moment. But you have to prepare yourself, and you have to let people know you're interested, and then you have to be patient, because it doesn't happen overnight. I came out of government in 2014, and I joined the Edison board in 2017. So it was 3 years, and in that 3-year period, trust me, I was interested, I was networking, I was talking to people, and it happened. So being persistent and patient at the same time, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I think that those are all great points. All I can add is excel at what you do.
Yeah.
Because particularly corporate boards are looking for distinctive individuals. And so Michael's absolutely right, with the great focus on diversity, for those of you who come from diverse backgrounds, that is a great extra attribute. It's an extra attribute.
Yeah.
And you need to bring the base attribute of being an excellent financial person or an excellent HR person or excellent operations person or whatever it is that your career path is. That's the core table stakes. I agree with the networking points that you made. When recruiters call, develop those relationships, because you want to end up on as many contact lists as possible. And then finally, when you do catch that lightning in the bottle, make sure it's the right lightning for you and that you have the bandwidth to commit and do a good job. And I'll be honest with you, I'm on the Edison board in addition to being a CEO of Edison. We've been going through a lot of stuff. I'm also really active with a number of organizations outside of Edison, vice chair of our industry association. I'll be chair next year. I've been on other academic boards, et cetera. I've now had a couple of different really interesting kind of S&P 250 offers to join public company boards, but they came smack in the middle of the stuff I've been dealing with, and I did not feel confident that I could manage my calendar with the kind of things we've been dealing with to be a reliable, consistent director. So, I will join a second public company board at some point, but I wanted to make sure that when I join, it's because I have the right bandwidth and the space. And so don't do something at a time in your life when you can't commit, because that may be the only chance you get.
And I've actually said no to some board. I've been reached out, and you have to know yourself and your strengths. And there have been some boards where I didn't think I was a particularly good, they were interested in me, but I didn't think I would be a particularly good fit. I didn't have the interest, or I didn't think that my background was a particularly good fit, or I knew other things about the company. There have been 3 instances like that. So you have to also be willing to be patient and wait. The last thing I'd say is get involved in other kinds of boards. Don't underestimate the importance of serving and holding leadership positions in nonprofit boards, and try to move up the food chain in the nonprofit world. There's your local charity, that's great, but if you're looking for a public company board, try to work yourself up to regional and national scale nonprofit boards as well.
Thank you for those insights. I think we have a few minutes for questions if anyone would like to raise their hand.
Yes, actually, I will start with the virtual audience today, really quickly. So give me one moment here. What are some common pitfalls of an individual that is new to board membership that you have seen over the years? Specifically, pitfalls that can be avoided through simple awareness or proactive coaching.
I had a hard time hearing that with the reverb. Can you?
Yeah.
I can
What are
definitely
some
do that
common
again.
pitfalls that new board members make that we've seen over the years that could be avoided with awareness? Let me take a
Yeah.
stab at that from my own experience and from observing. And I want to kind of make a point about this, a broader point. I think it's really important on a board, and Pedro's going to chuckle when he hears me saying this, but to listen more than you talk in the early days. And I don't know that I always got that balance just right because I'm a lawyer, I'm inquisitive, it's my nature. I'm used to, deposing people. I'm used to, really exploring.
I'm just sitting quietly here.
I'm just waiting. But I think sometimes, there's pressure on a new director sometimes to make your mark or to establish yourself or prove that you belong, or whatever, however you want to look at it. And I think that can sometimes lead folks to, not fully appreciate. I think taking time to learn the culture of a board and listening carefully, I think is very important. That said, it is interesting I'm going to just kind of veer off here on the diversity angle a little bit. One of the things I've noticed is that a lot of times for diverse people, African Americans, Latinos, women, you get to where you've gotten and you are at that point in your career because you haven't been one of those that just sits back. You're there because you lean forward, you participate, you engage the material, you're not a backbencher. So when you bring that same attitude to the board, sometimes it can surprise people, right? And so there's this balance that you have to self-regulate in a way that's not always natural or comfortable. But I think it's an important lesson to think about. So that's one thing. I think a second thing is what we've already discussed, which is just preparation. There are times, in all of our lives professionally where we've learned shortcuts and how to, you don't have to read everything and you kind of show up and you wing it. But these boards are, in my experience, quite rigorous. And if the time you wing it and you don't read something is the time that becomes an important topic of discussion and you regret it. So preparation and really showing up prepared, I think, is hugely important for new directors especially. And then I think there's also, the last thing I'll say is, and it goes again to board culture, there are a lot of unwritten rules. In different boards have them. I don't think Edison has this one as much, but I serve I'm on a total of 4 corporate boards, 2 public and 2 private, 2 venture-backed and 2 SEC regulated. And then I serve on the board of trustees at Stanford. And that board in particular is interesting because it's a big board, but there are unwritten rules about don't bring, and this applies to other contexts, well, but you don't bring something up with management that you haven't pre-vetted, that you haven't sort of talked to them in advance, or you don't want to surprise management. That's not the rule at Edison, but every board kind of has its unwritten rules of the road. And I think when you're new, sometimes it's hard to know what those are, and it takes time to figure it out.
I'll add a couple. One is on the balance point. I think that's natural for human beings, right? It can also go in the other direction. I can think of folks who coming in were doing too much of the listening, right?
Yeah.
Because they were in a new setting and they had valuable stuff to contribute day one, and they could have leaned in more. I think the other one I would throw in here is particularly when you're going through tough things, which I think any company will go through at some point, getting that sense of confidence and appropriately gauging the urgency and importance of any given risk. You also have to remember, management is going to be bringing typically, I think personally, if it's a good management team, they're bringing more bad news than good news. There should be an assumption that things are going well, and with the limited board time, I want to focus on, hey, here's the things that keep me up at night. I've seen sometimes newer board members who might react to that or react to a new issue and, wow, is that big? Is that, how do I deal with how I think about that? And being able to take that deep breath and, hopefully management helps put it into context. And, recognizing also that at an individual level, Well, Michael talked earlier about the business judgment rule, that it's not perfect, but that provides a lot of protection for directors, right? Because I think the law recognizes that, you have a limited set of information with which you are making judgments about a company, and you just need to bring your best efforts to the table. That brings a lot of protection. But I think for some newer directors, the liabilities of being a director can sometimes feel a little daunting at first and until they kind of get the broader context.
Yeah, the first time the general counsel tells you you're a named defendant in a $300 million lawsuit, it gets your attention. Although most of those suits go away, they're frivolous. But that is on your mind.
Those are good lessons to learn. I was in my career, I went through a financial restructuring of a company that went through a bankruptcy process. And it was actually a successful bankruptcy as a former entity that Edison had. There were 3 of us on the board of that entity, 2 independents and myself. And at some point, as happens in restructurings, which are kind of the hairy knuckle crowd, distressed debt sort of creditors, they filed draft motions against the 3 of us for a total of $2 billion. So I figured, well, it's okay. It's only $667 million a piece. You realize that was a very extreme situation. But frankly, going through a few of those claims, you just recognize that there's a part of business where, there's ambulance chasers, there's folks who make a cottage industry out of things like this, and you need to learn how to take a deep breath and basically be a good, steady corporate director with the long-term interests of all stakeholders in mind.
One other piece of advice to the new director to that question, Pedro alluded to this about debating in the boardroom and being a team player outside. I think one thing that is really important is to understand the importance of speaking with one voice as a company. That just made me, think about that. That sometimes, people approach you. Hey, what's happening? Hey, I read about this in the paper. Why is Edison doing that, or why isn't Edison doing that? And you're tempted to want to explain, but you've got to really be recognized as a director. You don't speak for the company, and you've got to be careful to manage that. And I think that new directors, it takes a while to learn, what your role is and what your responsibility is to the public.
I think we're going to have to leave it there. In the room.
Yes.
Yep.
I'm also a lawyer, so I'm used to speaking loud. Not a litigator, though, so I don't have this issue. I was general counsel at MetLife and at Freddie Mac for a total of about 8 years. So lots of experience like the ones that you have. I want to beg your indulgence for a question that's a little bit devil's advocate and combative about DE&I, especially on the executive level. So you talked about your recruiting pool that you're drawing from and that you're reading the statistics of the recruiting pool. But of course, if you take that logic to its conclusion, that's a race to the bottom, right? Because even though you're doing very well, most of your competitors are doing even worse. So beating what you're talking about as the pool is not really an answer to the question of getting true representativeness, not just for Latinos, but for all diverse demographics, right? So, I spoke to this room this morning about the question of really advancing diversity in the C-suite, and how do we do that? I heard you talk a little bit about sort of coaching and, I call it sponsorship. How are we really going to address the question of closing that gap? In your company, which is very good, you still have a gap of 2/3 between your Latino representation among the executives and your overall population. So I'd just like for you to address that and talk a little bit, not just as leaders of Edison International, but as corporate leaders in the United States. What do we need to do to the paradigm in order to fix this issue?
Sure. And so, Sid, we're going to spend the next hour, right? That is a great question. And when I referred to the national pool, I used that just to illustrate that, that is the reality of what we have today. I should have spent more time, though, talking about what I view as our responsibility to help increase that pool by building talent ourselves. When we have our board meeting next week, one of the things that Michael's going to see is, and because we're just reviewing all the decks for next week, good luck, it's a lot. Last year, we succeeded in filling something like 75% of our executive roles with internal candidates, right? Now, it's a balance, right? I would not want to see us filling 100% of our executive roles with internal candidates because I like having new blood coming in, new perspectives. I wouldn't want it to be zero. I wouldn't want it to be 100%. I don't know where the magic number is, but I like 75 for last year. Some years it might be 60. Some years it might be 80. That then goes to the ability that we have to help increase the broader pool, whether it's for us for the long run or some other folks might leave us, so then we're helping the broader community, other corporations, by bringing in early talent. And you heard me talk about the importance of the business resource groups. You heard me talk about working with groups like SHPE, right, the Hispanic Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, the campus recruiting, right, because that's the entry point for companies. It's also our intern programs, right, because that's another way to work even earlier than the college graduate. But at the core, the real point to solve the problem is one that we don't control as corporations, but we can help influence and support. And it's making sure that across our economy, we have an educational system that is racially, socially just, that is providing equal opportunity, regardless of whether you're growing up in Beverly Hills or in Pacoima, right? Regardless of your ethnic background or your parents' educational background or income level. I know this nirvana idealism, but the more we can move closer to that, the more we will see the problem addressed at the source, right? Which is, how's that Head Start program working for that kid who's going to help her, do okay in kindergarten and then do well in grammar school and then, have a good shot in high school to end up in a decent college, maybe get that scholarship and build up that career. So we can't realistically move the needle for the whole society, but we can try to do little things. I'll close by saying that's why one of probably my favorite Edison thing that I do all year, and that's, there's a lot of things I enjoy. There's a lot of things I don't, but there's a lot of things I do. We have a program called the Edison Scholars. And every year, we give a $40,000 scholarship to 30 high school seniors in SCE's service territory. And my favorite thing is when we bring them and their families into our headquarters for a reception. And it is moving. I'm going to mangle the numbers, but I want to say that certainly over half of the kids this year, and just about every year, are the first in their family to go to college. I want to say that something like 2/3 of them were diverse, but you can check me on that because we have this posted up on our website, and there's videos of all 30 of the winners from this year. We're not changing the whole society or the whole economy, but we are influencing 30 lives, and many of those lives, diverse lives, disadvantaged lives, and we become a part of their journey. And so if we do our 30 and Bank of America does some and AT&T does some and so on and so forth, before you know it, you have corporate America helping to move the needle collectively. And I think we can make a meaningful difference. By the way, we can also make a meaningful difference advocating in Washington, advocating in Sacramento, advocating at the local level to make sure that we fix the educational system and give equal opportunity.
I know we're out of time, but let me just say very concretely from my perspective, individually as a director, I mentioned the concept of deep selection. You called it sponsorship. In my experience, when I was hiring partner at O'Melveny, for example, and we had just a dearth of Latino and diverse associates and partners, look, as I mentioned Pedro for a reason. It starts at the top. We have a Latino CEO, so I'm just going to talk about Latinos for a moment. But I think there's no getting around this concept of sponsorship that you talk about. For many Latinos still in the executive ranks or in the entry level to the executive ranks, this is their first time, and this is maybe their first generation, and there's just no substitute for coaching. And there's also no substitute for being in a room and looking up and saying, oh, this guy made it, and this guy made it, and hopefully this gal made it, and if they can make it, I can make it. So It is, what I'm looking for as a director is that when Pedro and his management team come and present to us, first of all, I'm paying attention. Who's in the boardroom? Am I seeing just white faces? Am I seeing just black faces? Where are the Latinos in the boardroom as well? If they're not there, at the next level down, where are they? What are we doing to cultivate and coach that leadership? But Pedro's right fundamentally. It's a very small base, and so we can move the needle, but it takes a lot of time. And there's just no substitute for that hard work.
So I want to thank you. That's an excellent answer to the question. I think that we have to avoid thinking that we have to boil the ocean, right? We're not going to fix the entire educational system in the United States in a time frame that's relevant for addressing this issue. But that scholarship program is the kind of thing that we need to be doing. I was a member of something called the Inner City Scholarship Fund in New York, a group of lawyers that raised $10 million a year for scholarships for mostly Latino, but also African American kids to go to private school in New York City. And that scholarship fund graduated about 1,000 kids a year who then went on to college at a rate of 98% and graduated from college at a rate of 90% within 5 years. It's that kind of thing. We, directed strategic efforts to try to make sure that we're addressing the issues. And the last thing I want to say, mention this, all of it, to your industry association that you're going to be the chair of next year. Let's spread it around.
Yeah,
Let's make it into a movement.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Pedro, for the illuminating discussion. Thank you, Sid. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.